They came at dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, the whole valley was holding its breath. Elias Boone woke to the sound of something that didn't belong to morning, no cattle shifting, no whine through the boards, just silence thick enough to press against his chest, and when he opened his eyes, the light spilling through the cracks of his cabin felt wrong, too still, too watchful, and then he heard it, the faint creak of leather, the soft stamp of hooves that didn't wander but waited, and he reached for his boots without thinking. Every movement slow, deliberate, like a man stepping into a story he hadn't agreed to be part of, and when he pushed the door open, the world outside had already changed because there they were, 5 figures standing just beyond his fence line, Apache, unmoving, their silhouettes cut clean against the pale gold of early morning, their horses quiet, their eyes fixed on him as if they had been there long before he woke and would still be there long after he spoke, and Elias didn't speak. Not yet, because out here words had weight and he could feel something gathering in the air that didn't need them, and the dust at their feet hadn't even settled, as if they had arrived without sound, without warning, without leaving a trail he could follow back to reason, and one of them, a woman, stood slightly ahead, her posture steady, her gaze level, not hostile, not friendly, just certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than any drawn weapon ever could. And Elias Boone was a man who understood distance, the space between people, between choices, between past and present, but right then that distance felt thinner than it should have been, like something was about to cross it whether he allowed it or not, and he noticed the small things because that's what kept a man alive in places like this, the way their horses didn't shy, the way no one reached for anything at their side, the way even the wind seemed to hesitate before touching them, and then his eyes caught it. Something held low in the hands of a child standing near the woman, a piece of leather, worn, darkened by time, tied with a strip of cloth he knew too well, and his chest tightened before his mind could catch up, because memory doesn't ask permission, it just arrives, and suddenly the quiet morning wasn't empty anymore, it was full of something waiting to be named, and behind him the cabin creaked as if reminding him it was still there, still his, still ground he understood, but out in front of him stood something older than ownership, older than fences, older than the idea that land could belong to any one man. And Elias shifted his weight, not forward, not back, just enough to feel where he stood. Because whatever came next wasn't going to be decided by who spoke first, but by who understood what had already been set in motion long before this morning ever began. The valley had not felt this tight in years, not since the last time men from town rode past his fence with eyes that judged more than they saw, and Elias Boone stood there with the door half open behind him, knowing that whatever peace he had built out here had always been thin, like frost that disappears the moment the sun decides to look at it, and he could already feel that sun climbing, slow and certain, stretching light across the dirt until every shadow had to choose where it belonged. And Elias had lived long enough to know that men made the same choice when they were watched, and right now he was being watched from more than one direction because the figures in front of him were not the only ones awake, not anymore, and down the slope beyond his pasture, just past the broken fence post he never fixed, there was movement, faint at first, then clearer, shapes gathering where the land dipped toward the road that led into town, and he did not need to turn his head to know what that meant because word traveled faster than horses out here, faster than reason too, and it carried only one version of the truth, the kind that turned 5 quiet figures into something much larger in the minds of men who had never taken the time to look twice, and Elias felt it before he heard it, the shift in the air, the way silence changed shape when it was about to break, and sure enough the distant echo of hooves reached him. Not hurried, not calm, just steady, the kind of riding that came with purpose. And too many assumptions, and he let out a slow breath, not because he was afraid, but because he understood the weight of what was about to collide right there in the dust between his door and that fence line, and still the Apache family did not move, not a step, not a glance, as if whatever had brought them here had already decided its course and did not concern itself with who else might arrive, and the woman at the front remained the same, steady, grounded, her presence anchoring the others. In a way that felt less like command and more like certainty, and that certainty began to press against something in Elias he had kept buried under years of quiet living, a memory not yet clear but close enough to touch, and his eyes drifted again to the child, to the object held carefully in both hands, and now in the growing light he could see more of it, the stitching uneven in places, the leather worn soft from use, and that strip of cloth tied around it, faded but still carrying the faint trace of a pattern he had seen before, not in this moment, not in this place, but somewhere else, somewhere colder, somewhere louder, with the sound of water moving faster than it should, and his fingers twitched at his side as if remembering something his mind had not fully allowed yet, and behind him the valley began to fill with presence, not noise yet, but the promise of it, men approaching with questions already answered in their heads. And Elias knew the shape of those answers because he had heard them before, had lived inside them once, and he knew how quickly a moment like this could turn into something that no one could take back, and still no one spoke, not him, not them, not the land itself, because sometimes the most important part of a story was the breath held right before it decided what kind of story it was going to become. The first rider came into view like a memory Elias had tried to forget, not because of the man himself but because of what always followed behind him, and Sheriff Colton Hayes rode at the front with that same careful posture he always wore, like a man trying to balance law on one side and fear on the other. His hat pulled low, his eyes already measuring the distance between the cabin and the figures standing beyond the fence, and behind him came three more from town, not deputies, not anything official, just men who believed showing up early meant they had a say in how things ended, and Elias did not turn to greet them, did not step forward or back, because he knew that movement would be read as intention. And intention out here was something men acted on before they understood it, and the sheriff slowed his horse about 20 yards out, letting the dust settle around him in a thin cloud that drifted between two worlds that did not trust each other, and for a moment no one spoke, not even the newcomers, because even they could feel that something about this morning did not belong to them, and then Hayes cleared his throat, the sound dry, uncertain, as if even his voice was not sure it should be used yet, and he looked from Elias to the Apache family and back again, weighing what he saw against what he had been told, and what he had been told was always simpler than what stood in front of him now, and one of the men behind him shifted in his saddle, impatient, whispering something under his breath that carried just enough edge to reach Elias without forming full words, and Elias felt that old tension begin to stretch across the space like a rope pulled too tight, not snapping yet, but close enough that everyone could hear the strain, and still the Apache did not move, not even when the horses approached, not even when the sheriff's presence settled into the scene like a question that demanded an answer, and Elias realized then that whatever this was, it was not about territory, not about challenge, not even about him, not in the way the others thought, because the stillness in front of him held something else, something deliberate, something that had chosen patience over reaction. And that kind of choice did not come from anger, it came from purpose, and his eyes drifted again to the child, to the object held with both hands, and the morning light caught it just right, revealing a faint line of stitching he remembered placing there himself, uneven because his hands had been cold that night, his fingers stiff. As he worked by firelight that kept threatening to go out, and the memory came sharper now, not full, not yet, but enough to press against his chest like something asking to be acknowledged, and the sheriff spoke finally, his voice low but carrying, asking a question that sounded more like a warning than a greeting, and Elias did not answer right away because the answer forming in his mind was not one the others were ready to hear, not one they would understand standing where they were, and somewhere in the distance another set of hooves echoed faintly, more riders drawn by the same unfinished story, and Elias Boone stood between them all, one man on a piece of land that suddenly felt smaller than it had the night before, knowing that whatever happened next would not be decided by who had the loudest voice, but by who remembered the truth first. The sheriff's question hung in the air like dust that refused to settle, simple on the surface but carrying the weight of everything that could follow it, and Elias Boone finally stepped forward one pace, not enough to close the distance, just enough to claim his place in it, his boots pressing into the dry earth that had known him longer than any man in that valley, and he kept his hands loose at his sides, visible, empty, because he understood what the others did not yet see, that this moment was not about force, it was about what each man believed was already true, and Sheriff Hayes watched him closely, searching for signs he could read, something familiar, something that fit inside the rules he knew how to enforce, but Elias offered him none of that, only a stillness that came from somewhere deeper than caution, and behind the sheriff one of the townsmen shifted again, louder this time, his voice breaking through the quiet with a sharp edge that did not belong, saying they had no right to be there, saying land was land and lines were lines, and the words fell flat the moment they left his mouth because even he could hear how small they sounded against the silence held by the figures across the fence, and that was when the child moved, just one step forward, slow enough that it felt like time itself had to adjust around it, and every eye followed that movement without choice, drawn to it the way men are drawn to things they do not understand but know they should, and the object in the child's hands lifted slightly, not offered yet, just revealed more clearly, and Elias felt the memory finally break through, not in pieces now but whole, like a door opening after being held shut too long, and he saw it again as it had been, the river running high from early thaw, water cutting through rock with a force that did not care who stood in its way, and a small figure caught near the edge, struggling not against the water alone but against something deeper, fear that reached beyond that moment, and Elias had not thought then, had not weighed consequence or meaning, he had only moved, stepping into water that bit cold through his bones, reaching out with hands that did not ask permission, and when he pulled the child free, the world had narrowed to breath and heartbeat and the simple fact that life was still there where it could have been gone, and later, by a fire that barely held against the night, he had taken a strip of his own shirt and tied it around a small leather piece the child carried, reinforcing what had nearly been lost, not because it mattered to him but because it mattered to the child, and he had sent them back into the dark without asking for a name, without expecting to ever see that moment again, and now here it was, standing in the morning light like something returned not by chance but by design. And Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely there, and when he looked up, his eyes met the woman's for the first time with recognition that did not need words, and the valley seemed to lean in closer, waiting, as if even the land understood that the past had just stepped into the present and was about to decide what kind of future would follow. The recognition did not come with relief, it came with weight, the kind that settles into a man's chest and reminds him that nothing done in silence ever truly disappears, and Elias Boone stood there with the memory still fresh in his hands, even though the river was miles away and the cold of that night had long since left his bones. And the child across from him held the same piece of leather now steadied by the strip he had torn from his own shirt, the stitching uneven, the knot tied tighter than it needed to be, just as it had been when his fingers had worked in the dim firelight, and for a moment the years between then and now felt thinner than they should have been, like something that could be crossed with a single step if a man was not careful, and the woman stepped forward then, not sudden, not slow, just certain. And the others behind her remained where they were, as if her movement spoke for all of them, and Elias watched her closely, not out of suspicion, but because he understood that this was the moment everything would either hold together or come apart, and Sheriff Hayes shifted in his saddle, uneasy now, his hand resting near his belt not out of threat but out of habit, the kind that fills silence when a man does not know what to do with it, and the townsmen behind him exchanged glances that carried more fear than they would admit, because what they had expected was not this, not stillness, not restraint, not something that did not fit into the story they had already decided to believe, and the woman stopped just short of the fence line, her eyes on Elias, not on the sheriff, not on the others, only on him, and when she spoke her voice was steady, clear, shaped by a language learned carefully, each word placed with intention rather than speed, and she said his name as if it had been carried a long distance, held on to, not forgotten, and Elias felt that settle into him deeper than anything else that morning, because he had never given it that night, not to the child, not to anyone, and yet here it was, returned to him with a familiarity that made the air feel different, and the child stepped forward beside her, lifting the leather piece fully now, offering it not across the fence but toward him, arms extended with a kind of quiet respect that did not ask for permission, but did not demand it either, and Elias moved then, just one step closer, enough to close the space between past and present, and he did not reach out immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that taking it would mean accepting something more than an object, it would mean acknowledging that what he had done in a moment he barely remembered had not been small, had not been lost, had not been without consequence, and the valley around them seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for a choice that no one else could make for him, and Elias Boone, a man who had spent years keeping distance between himself and everything that might tie him down, finally raised his hand, slow, steady, and reached toward the piece of leather that had traveled all the way back to him, carrying with it a story that was no longer his alone. His fingers closed around the leather slowly, as if the past might pull back if he moved too quickly, and for a brief second nothing else existed in that valley except the feel of that worn surface in his hand, the slight give where the stitching had stretched over time, the faint trace of smoke and earth that no amount of years could erase, and Elias Boone understood then that this was not something being returned, it was something being completed, a circle drawn wider than he had ever intended, and when he lifted his eyes again the woman was still watching him, steady, unshaken, her expression carrying something that was not relief and not expectation, but recognition, the kind that did not need to be explained, and behind her the others remained in place, yet the air around them had shifted, softened in a way that the men from town did not trust, and Sheriff Hayes leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his voice lower now, cautious, asking what this meant, not demanding. Just asking, because even he could feel that whatever answer came would not belong to him, and Elias did not respond right away, not because he did not have words, but because he knew they would not be enough, not for what stood here, not for what had already been decided before any of them arrived, and then the woman spoke again, her voice carrying across the space with the same measured calm, and she said that her son had kept this for many seasons, that he had been told to remember the man who did not ask who he was, who did not ask what he would receive, who simply acted and walked away, and she said that where they came from, such things did not disappear, they were carried, honored, returned when the time was right, and the word settled over the valley like something older than law, older than ownership, something that did not argue or explain, only existed, and one of the townsmen let out a breath that turned into a quiet scoff, the kind meant to break tension but only making it more visible, muttering that a strip of leather did not mean anything, that this was land and not stories, and Elias felt that familiar divide open again, not between men, but between ways of seeing the world, and he could have spoken then, could have explained, could have tried to bridge that gap with reason, but he did not, because he understood that some things were not meant to be translated, only witnessed. And that was when the first new figures appeared along the ridge beyond the pasture, not rushing, not hidden, just there, one after another, until the line stretched longer than it had any right to, silhouettes forming against the brightening sky, and the men from town stiffened, their certainty cracking just enough to let something else in, something quieter, something closer to realization, and Elias did not turn to look at them, because he already knew what they would see, not a threat, not a challenge, but something far more difficult to stand against. A presence built not on force, but on memory, on promise, on a single act that had traveled farther than he ever had, and the woman's gaze never left his as she took one more step forward, closing the last of the distance between them without crossing it, and in that space, that narrow line between two worlds, Elias Boone understood that this moment was no longer about what he had done, but about what it had become. The line along the ridge did not stop growing, and by the time the sun had climbed high enough to cast full light across the valley, what had begun as 5 figures at a fence had become something that no one present could ignore or explain away, and still there was no rush, no raised voices, no sudden movement, only the steady arrival of men who rode with purpose but not urgency, their horses stepping sure across ground that remembered them long before fences were ever placed upon it, and the townsmen shifted again, this time without trying to hide it, their earlier confidence thinning into something uncertain, something quieter, because what they had expected was confrontation, something loud, something they could answer with more of the same, but this was different, this was presence, and presence could not be argued with, and Sheriff Hayes drew in a slow breath, his posture changing just enough to show that he understood the balance had shifted, not in a way that threatened him, but in a way that made his authority feel smaller than it had an hour ago, and Elias Boone stood where he had been all along, the piece of leather still in his hand, its weight now far greater than the thing itself, because it carried not just memory but meaning that had been carried across distance, across seasons, across lives that did not intersect until now, and the woman stepped forward one final pace, close enough now that the line between them was no longer about land or ownership but about understanding, and she lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, not in hesitation, but in a gesture that held something older than either of them, something that spoke without needing to be translated, and then she straightened again and said quietly, clear enough for all to hear, that her people do not forget those who choose right when no one is watching, that such choices are remembered longer than any law written by men who only see what is in front of them, and the words moved through the gathered silence like wine through dry grass, not forceful, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and then, without signal or command, the first of the figures behind her shifted, dismounting slowly, followed by another, and another, until one by one they stepped down onto the earth with the same measured calm, forming not a line of challenge but a presence that filled the space without claiming it, and even the horses seemed to understand, standing quiet, heads lowered slightly as if the moment asked it of them, and Elias watched it all without moving, because he understood now that what stood before him was not something meant to be resisted or answered, but something meant to be witnessed, and the child, still at the front, looked up at him with eyes that carried none of the fear from that night by the river, only something steady, something sure, and in that look Elias saw the true shape of what had been set in motion, not debt, not obligation, but a bond that had been chosen freely and returned just as freely, and behind him the men from town said nothing now, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound smaller than the truth unfolding in front of them, and the valley, wide and open as it was, suddenly felt like a place where something quiet had taken root, something stronger than force, something that did not need to prove itself, only to stand. No one gave the order, yet everything shifted at once, not with force, not with sound, but with intention, and Elias Boone felt it before he saw it, the way the air seemed to settle into something steady, something decided, and the woman turned slightly, just enough for those behind her to understand, and one by one they moved, not forward, not outward, but into place, spreading along the edges of the land in a quiet arc that did not cross the fence yet somehow reached beyond it, and the riders on the ridge adjusted as well, their silhouettes aligning with the ground below in a way that felt less like arrival and more like presence taking its proper shape, and the townsmen watched with growing unease, not because they were being threatened, but because they were no longer the ones defining what this moment meant, and Sheriff Hayes lowered his hand from his belt, not as a sign of surrender but as a recognition that whatever authority he carried had no place in what was unfolding, and Elias stood still, the leather in his hand warm now from his grip, its meaning no longer tied to memory alone but to what stood before him, and the child stepped back beside the woman, their part finished, their role fulfilled, and the woman spoke once more, her voice quiet but carrying across the space with the same calm certainty, saying that her people had come not to take, not to challenge, but to stand, to ensure that the man who had once acted without witness would not stand alone when others chose to judge what they did not understand, and the words settled over the gathered men like something undeniable, not loud enough to argue with, not forceful enough to resist, but clear enough that even those who had arrived with certainty felt it shift beneath them, and one of the townsmen glanced at the others, then back at the ridge, then finally down at the ground as if searching for something solid to hold on to. But there was nothing there that could compete with what surrounded them now, and Elias Boone did not smile, did not speak, did not step forward or back, because he understood that this was not something to be accepted or refused, it simply was, and the line that had once divided his land from the world beyond it had become something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to ownership but to connection, and as the sun climbed higher, casting full light across every face, every figure, every quiet stance, the truth of it settled in, not as a moment that would pass, but as something that would remain long after the riders turned and the dust fell still again, because what had been returned this morning was not a favor, not a debt, but a promise that had grown larger than any one man could carry alone, and now it stood around him, silent, steady, and impossible to ignore. The valley did not break into noise when it ended, it loosened, slowly, like a held breath finally released, and one by one the figures along the edges of the land began to move, not in retreat, not in victory, but in quiet completion, as if what they had come to do had already been done the moment Elias Boone chose to remember, and the riders on the ridge turned their horses with the same steady calm they had arrived with, their silhouettes drifting away into the distance until they became part of the land again, and the men from town remained where they were for a moment longer, uncertain, their earlier words gone, replaced by something they could not easily name, and Sheriff Hayes was the first to move, guiding his horse back a few steps, not out of fear, but out of understanding, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is standing in something that does not belong to him to control, and the others followed without being told, their presence shrinking as they turned toward the road, carrying with them a story that would sound different depending on who told it, but would never again be as simple as they had hoped, and through it all Elias did not move, not until the woman stepped back, her gaze still on him for a final moment, and then she gave the smallest nod, not as thanks, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement of something shared, something complete, and she turned, her son. Beside her, the leather no longer needed in his hands because it had found its place again, and together they walked back toward their horses, mounting with the same quiet grace, and without another word they rode, not away, but onward, as if this place was now part of a path rather than a destination, and the dust they left behind settled quickly, as though the land itself was careful not to disturb what had just taken root. And when the last of them disappeared beyond the rise, the valley returned to its familiar shape, the fence still standing, the cabin still weathered, the wind moving again through the dry grass, and yet nothing was the same, not in the way Elias felt the ground beneath his boots, not in the way the horizon looked back at him, and he stood there for a long moment, the leather still in his hand, then slowly, without ceremony, he tucked it into his pocket, not as something to display, but as something to carry, and he turned back toward his cabin, the door still open behind him, the morning now fully awake, and as he stepped inside, the light followed him in, stretching across the worn floorboards, quiet, steady, unchanged, and yet somehow deeper than before, because out here, where men often believed that justice came from who spoke loudest or stood strongest, something else had taken hold, something that did not need a voice, did not need a weapon, only a single choice made when no one was watching, and the willingness to stand by it when everyone finally was.